So good afternoon. Thank you all for being here again on a double weekend. Not only are we talking about Valentine's Day, but President's Day. Okay, so Christine has a bunch of questions. The last one we'll talk about in a moment. So one question is that it's okay to forego a mitzvah to save a life, but then it says the ultimate act of Kiddush Hashem is to kill yourself rather than do so. So what I tried to explain last time is that there are certain commandments that you're not supposed to trespass, and if it's a choice between doing that and dying, you're supposed to die. At least that's the traditional understanding. So committing a inappropriate sexual act, murder, and idolatry, those are things you're not supposed to do. So the Kiddush Hashem that I mentioned last time is, it really means, the holiness of God, that you are sacrificing yourself for the sake of God's holiness. And so if, for example, during the Crusades, when the Crusaders came and wanted people to become Christian or die, they chose death over conversion to Christianity, which was considered a form of idolatry. So even though, yes, saving a life just about supersedes any other commandment, including the Shabbat restrictions, the fact is that there are certain commandments that are so important that you will in fact sacrifice your life. Does that make sense, Christine? Okay, and then the number 10 for a minyan. So there are a couple places. There's one place in the Torah where Moses gathers a group of elders, and it's 10, and that's what he calls an assembly. So that's one place. And the other one is when God tells Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, but what if there are 50 righteous people? And God says, okay, then I won't for 50. What if there are 40, 30, 20, etc.? And gets God down to 10. And at 10, God says, they stop negotiating. So the idea is that somehow 10 is a critical number. Okay, great. So, and the one about Shabbat we'll get to in a moment, because we're going to talk about Shabbat today. So any other questions? Yes, please, Bobby.
This is a question from the reading this week. Do you want to wait?
Go ahead. I'll see.
Oh, I was just surprised to read that Israel was anti-religious. Did I misunderstand? I mean,
no, you didn't. Israel, you mean in the early days of Israel?
Yeah.
Yeah. And well, so the people who founded the country were essentially, Jews from, Germany, Eastern Europe, that area. And they were kind of rebelling against the traditional way in which Jews had been brought up to be yeshiva buchers. You may have heard that expression, people who just study in yeshiva, who went like sheep to the slaughter during the Holocaust. And they were emphasizing a different kind of person, somebody who was not necessarily religious, but somebody who was strong physically, who could work the land, who could hold a gun. I mean, the early images of Israelis were, either holding a plow or, working a big farm machine or holding a big gun. And the idea was, that it was a different kind of person. And it was pretty anti-religious, yes, which makes you maybe surprised to find out that today the religious parties have so much power. And part of it is that they thought that the religious, the ultra-religious would sort of die out eventually. They were wrong. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Israel. So any other questions? I mean, they were more labor union type people who founded Israel than, religious folks. Because you know what? Here's one of the problems with the religious folks, and this is why actually some of the religious people are anti-Zionist. They don't believe that creating the state of Israel was the job of human beings. They believe it was the job of God and the Messiah. So they're waiting for the Messiah to do it, not for the secular powers that be to create the state. Okay, well, it's good to see everybody. We're going to talk today about the Jewish calendar and then specifically about Shabbat. So I'm going to share my screen So the Jewish calendar, that is what we're going to be talking about today. All right. So we're going to look at how the Jewish calendar is structured, how it's different from the secular calendar, and then we're going to look at Shabbat specifically. So the Jewish calendar is a combination of lunar and solar. It would theoretically be a lunar calendar pretty much, but every so often, and it's a complicated process, the calendar is called intercalated, where they adjust it because Passover has to always occur in the spring. And Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur have to always occur in the fall. So if we just were based on a lunar calendar, things would fall in different seasons, and that wouldn't work out right. So it's corrected periodically by adding an extra month of Adar every few years. So even though it's the year 2021 right now for our secular purposes, the fact is that as far as the Jewish calendar is concerned, it's the year 5781. And that's based on a calculation that was made by the rabbis that the world was theoretically created 5,781 years ago. Now, of course, you'll say, well, wait a minute, isn't the world like billions of years old? And there are people who are able to kind of take the secular scientific approach and the religious approach and say, well, you know, a year in God's life is, you know, a billion years in our life. And so there's some way to make that work. But in any event, this is the year 5,781. And Bobby, you had asked last time about BCE. So again, this is what we use before the Common Era and the Common Era. We don't base our calendar or even our reference to the secular calendar on Jesus's life. So in the Torah, when God creates the world, it says there was evening, there was morning, the first day. Therefore, in the Jewish calendar, the day begins in the evening. It does not begin in the morning. So for example, Shabbat begins on Friday night, and I'll answer that question that Christine asked in a moment about why it's the sixth day or the seventh day. But because it says that there was evening, there was morning, the first day, this is how our days are calculated. So any holiday, for example, begins in the evening and then the next day. So Shabbat starts Friday night after sundown, and it lasts until sundown the next day on Saturday. If you were to look at a Jewish calendar, now there's something called Hebrew calendar. If you put that into Google, you can find one really good Hebrew or Jewish calendar. It'll tell you when all the holidays are, when candle lighting is, what the Torah readings are. I mean, you can adjust the calendar so you'll know, because for example, we read the Torah all year. There are 54 Torah portions. We read one every week. Obviously, since there are only 52 weeks and 54 portions, and that there's some special Torah readings on holidays, there are obviously days when we do more than one during the week. So sometimes we read 2 Torah portions in a week in order to be able to catch up. And then by the time we're done with the cycle, we start all over again. Now, believe it or not, of all of the holidays, the most important holiday in the Jewish calendar is Shabbat. It is not Yom Kippur, it is not Rosh Hashanah, it's Shabbat. And it is one of the 10 commandments to observe Shabbat. And okay, Aliyah, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but an Aliyah is being called up to the Torah, basically to say the Torah blessings. Okay, now in order to do that, we basically say God chose us to receive the Torah. And so you have to be Jewish and you have to be 13 or older. And that's why a bar mitzvah is called up to the Torah. That is really the moment when they are an official bar mitzvah, although all you have to be is 13. But that's the moment when, for the first time, the young person is actually allowed to say this blessing. You can only say a blessing like that on behalf of the congregation if you're obligated to it. If you're not obligated to it, then you're not doing it on behalf of the congregation. So on Shabbat, there are 7 aliyot. There's 7 times that people are called up to make a blessing over the Torah reading. And on Yom Kippur, there's 6. On Rosh Hashanah, there are 5. So that you can tell from that the more aliyot, the more special the holiday is. So Shabbat is a day of spiritual enrichment, of rest. And it really means, it comes from the verb to cease. Okay, and it's not necessarily a day of prayer. We'll find out more about that in a moment, but it is from the Bible. In the very beginning, right? God is creating the world in 6 days, and then God is going to take a rest. So on the 7th day, God finished the work God had been doing. So on the 7th day, God rested. This is the first time that we see the word Shabbat, because it's not Shabbat, but Shavat, because it's the verb. God rested from God's work. And then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy. And so here you have this very, very important holiday called holy for the very first time. Very, very important. Now, here's a question. I'm going to come back to all of you. So we assume that the Torah was edited in Babylonia during the exile. Okay, so in 586, the temple was destroyed. We'll go into that when we do our history class. But the temple was destroyed, and not every single person from Israel, but at least the elites were exiled to Babylonia. And while there were, so here we go. We had, and we're going to talk about this again during the history class, but it's worth repeating. You had basically a cult, a religious cult that was centered around the temple, because that's where you brought your sacrifices, in a special place called Israel, under the rulership of King David or someone from his family. Now you have the Babylonians in 586 BCE who destroy the temple, kick Israel out of the country, destroy the king and his lineage. What do? How do you preserve the religion? Let me hear some suggestions that you might have about how do you preserve the religion? How does a religion continue if it's based on a temple, a country, and a dynasty, and you have none of those anymore? Brandon, yes.
You have to unclick. I'm sorry.
You start to add in customs that are outside of the temple, outside of the sacrifices from before. You find new ways to be able to adapt them, as the Pharisees were able to do, compared to the Sadducees, who weren't able to adapt, and now we don't see the Sadducees around.
So what kind of customs would you think?
Well, first and foremost, Shabbat, being able to have a weekly observance of the greatness of rest. That's the first thing you want to do, is make sure that people are actively able to tell. Because if you're going 3 or 4 months under Babylonian control and you have no hope that things are getting better, having a weekly update of seeing the progress that you're making is something that would be important in Babylonia. Whereas if they just kept it to the general functions of every 3 or 4 months having a high holy day, you're not going to have that congregation continuing.
Good, good. Thank you. Okay, Suzanne, did you have your hand up?
I was just going to say that. Oh,
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that if you don't have space anymore that can be sacred, then you need to make time sacred.
Beautiful. Now hang on to that, because we're going to get to that. That's beautiful. Okay, Bobby or Beverly?
I was going to say rituals.
Ritual.
A way of people connecting that transcends any physical space or place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You might want to lower your camera a little bit, because I see mainly your forehead.
Okay.
There you go. That's
Yeah,
better.
that's
Okay. Christine, did you have?
Yeah, connecting all of these things is the notion of sharing history and telling the stories so that people don't forget how they got to be that way and where their strength comes from. So that community building through ritual, through, observances and, reciting not recitation per se, but telling stories
Great.
are really important
Great.
in
Okay,
any
that's great.
diaspora, actually.
Absolutely. Great answers. Of course, having a written document of the Torah was very important as well, because it meant that now you have this information, the history, the values, the rituals, whatever it is that we've been talking about, you have that available to everybody. And you also have the possibility of interpreting what all of this means. So the written document of the Torah is very important, but of course, Shabbat being absolutely, and as you said, on a regular basis. So we're not talking about doing this, once every few months, but every week. So that's great. That's great. Okay, any other comments? Any questions before we continue? Carl, oh no, that's my hand. My hand was going across Carlos's square and I thought, oh, he had his hand up. Okay, so let's go back to, so this is, so now notice, by the way, that this is what God did. So we're trying to, on a certain level, imitate God. There's 6 days of work that are very important, but there's also an important day of resting. Of course, it's not clear what that means, and we're going to try to unpack that. So there are 2 places where it tells us to observe Shabbat. So the first one is in Exodus, and it says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the 7th day shall be a Sabbath of Adonai your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and then Adonai rested on the 7th day. Therefore, Adonai blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. By the way, Adonai is one of the names of God, and it has traditionally been translated as my Lord, which is exactly what it means. However, given the fact that my Lord is very gendered, the choice has been recently to simply either say source of life or you or God, or just leave Adonai, and that way no one has to think about it. All right, now here's the other place in Deuteronomy. This is sort of a second version of the 10 Commandments. The one earlier is from the 10 Commandments. So observe the 7th day and keep it holy, as Adonai your God has commanded you. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the 7th day shall be a Sabbath of Adonai your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox, your donkey, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. So your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, Adonai your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Okay, now let's unpack all of this. And what do you notice about these 2 commandments to observe the Sabbath? What does it include? And also what the difference is between those 2. It's probably a little hard not to have it right in front of you, but let's try to do it without it in front of us. If need be, I'll put it back up on the screen. What do you notice about this particular holiday of Sabbath?
They both mentioned slaves.
They both mention slaves. Okay, so on the one hand, you could say, what do you mean slaves? Okay, but there's a whole section. Actually, this week's Torah portion was mishpatim, which means laws, and it includes laws about slaves. So that's disturbing. Yes, it is. Here we just left slavery in Egypt, and yet we're saying, oh, by the way, this is how you should treat your own slaves.
Yeah.
So that is good that you notice that, but it also says that the slaves are allowed to have a day off.
I mean, for me, I couldn't focus on it because I was just thinking about what Shabbat meant growing up for me. And what I thought of was restrictions.
Yeah, we will get to that. We will definitely get to that. Okay. What else have people noticed about what Shabbat is all about? Who is Shabbat for? Yes, Suzanne.
Everyone.
Shabbat is for everyone. It's for your workers. It's for your animals. It's for your slaves. It's for everybody. Okay. It's not like, and this is a big innovation on the part of Judaism. Slaves Otherwise would be working all the time. And your animals, but no, you give a rest. And by the way, you also give a rest to the earth, because every 7 years, the earth is supposed to lie fallow. So it's a very important concept to have this Sabbath. Do you see a difference here? Let me share the screen again, and let's look at, all right, this is the Exodus slide. So take a look at that. What is the reason given here for why we were supposed to observe the Sabbath?
Because God observed the Sabbath.
Because God observed the Sabbath, exactly. This is imitatio Deo, right? We're trying to imitate God. This is what God did. And so therefore, we're going to try to imitate God as well. Okay, now let's look at the second one. So this is from the 10 Commandments. And then there's a reiteration of the 10 Commandments later in Deuteronomy. What's the reason here?
God from slavery.
To remember your slavery.
Right, you were slaves, and you know what it's like to be a slave. And therefore, you need to be conscious of giving other people a break, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we were just looking at. What are the rationale? What is the same in these two texts? In the two texts, we see that we are supposed to give a break to all our workers, everybody in our community. Nobody's to be treated differently. And on the one hand, we observe Shabbat because God did. And on the other hand, we do it because we were slaves in Egypt and we know what it's like. So remember the Sabbath. We're commanded to remember Shabbat, but remembering means much more than merely not forgetting. It also means to remember the significance of Shabbat, both as a commemoration of creation and as a commemoration of our freedom from slavery in Egypt. So it reminds us of both of those things. On the one hand, that God created the world for our sake, but also rested, and also God freed us from slavery. So this is where we get to the restrictions that Beverly was talking about. So to observe the Sabbath day, you have to talk about what is forbidden, what you cannot do. It's called malacha in Hebrew. And it's not just any work. It's not like if I go in my backyard and well, you're probably not supposed to be digging, but let's just say I don't know, I do something that requires physical labor. That is not the definition of work. The definition of work is what is creative, what actually has an impact on the world around us. So that's what I'm not allowed to do. So instead of doing, I'm supposed to be. I just need to be and exist and let the world be what it is around me and not try to change it, not try to have an impact on it. That's really what the work of Shabbat that is forbidden, which is why we'll see in a moment, we can also extrapolate from this and say, well, maybe you're not supposed to dig and plant, which is part of the work that's forbidden. But if I think of it in terms of, I don't know, something that's spiritually fulfilling for me or something that doesn't necessarily impact the environment negatively, maybe it's okay for me to do it. I mean, that's the way to interpret. But the idea is that 6 days a week, we try to have dominion or control over our environment, but 1 day a week, we accept the fact that, you know what, we don't have as much control as we think we do or as we would like to have. And where do they come up with the categories of work? Well, because it says that you're supposed to observe Shabbat right next to a whole section that explains how to build the new temple or the tabernacle. It's the categories of work that are connected to the building of the tabernacle. Now, not that all of these seem to be connected, but these are the categories of work that you're not allowed to be engaged in. There's 39, which is 40 save 1. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, cleansing crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, which I doubt any of us are going to be doing on Shabbat. Shearing wool, washing or beating or dyeing it, spinning, weaving, making 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads, tying a knot, loosening a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, hunting a gazelle, slaughtering or flaying or salting it or curing its skin, scraping it or cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down, putting out a fire, lighting a fire, striking with a hammer, and taking anything from one domain into the other. So those are the categories that are forbidden, anything kind of connected to that. Obviously, again, most of these are not categories of work that we're going to be too involved in our, urban life. But obviously a lot of these things, for example, you're not allowed to tear. So for example, if you're very observant, you're not going to tear toilet paper. You have to pre-cut it, pre-tear it up. You obviously can't cook on Shabbat. You definitely can't put out a fire. I mean, put out or light a fire. You're not supposed to use electricity. So from this, you can basically deduce all sorts of things that you can or cannot do. But these are all, believe it or not, connected to the building of the tabernacle, because a lot of this about like the wool and whatever are materials that were used in the tabernacle. So here, questions.
One thing that I've been struggling with as I've been putting together Shabbat and I'm adding in these different practices is that there's a lot of granularity between fully observing Shabbat and partially observing Shabbat, and whether if I just wanted to see if we're going to go into a discussion later on about the granularity of observance depending on Reform versus Orthodox, so on and so forth.
Well, what we will talk about are some, as I said, technically there's some things you're not allowed to do. For example, carrying, you're not allowed to carry from one domain to the other. So in other words, you have a private domain and you have a public domain. So you're not allowed, for example, to carry something from your home to the street, because the idea is you're supposed to cease from any kind of commercial activity. And, once you're out in the street in the public, it becomes the possibility of the marketplace and getting involved in commercial activity. So first of all, that makes it very, very difficult to observe Shabbat because when you're supposed to stay in your house all day, you don't go to someone's house carrying a dish of food that you're going to share with them, or carrying your kid or something. So what happens is that traditional communities will create what's called an eruv, which is a sort of fictional line that is carried around the neighborhood. It's like it could be the telephone line could be part of it. And then let's say there's not enough to go around a particular neighborhood, then you put a string around it. So you create this sort of legal fiction that this area that you have now, kind of taken a string and sort of tied off, this is now considered a private domain. And so you can carry within the private domain. That's how they get around things like that. But anyway, so if you're observant, you're going to listen to all of these rules. You're not going to cook. Although again, there are a lot of nuances in there. Like, can you reheat? Can you get a cup of hot tea? I mean, it's not all uniform about how it's all interpreted. But there's things that you're not going to do. You're going to cook the night before. There's a special hot plate that you use to keep things hot that is not really cooking. There are even discussions in the Talmud about, well, what happens if I have like an egg and it drops on the sidewalk and the sidewalk's really hot and it cooks it? Can I eat it? Those kinds of things. If I open a can of Coke and I take off the tab, is that work? I mean, there are millions of questions to ask and how to apply these, but you're going to follow all of that. Now, if you're Reform and you say, I want to be able to understand all the mitzvahs of Shabbat, but I'm not sure I'm going to follow all of them. I'm going to do the ones that are significant to me. So for example, let's say I'm not going to drive, but I'm still going to go out to dinner. You're not supposed to use money on Shabbat, right? So, you sort of pick and choose depending on what's significant to you and what, makes sense to you. There's a suggestion that I think I have a little bit later on about, well, what if spiritual renewal, which is part of the purpose of Shabbat, what if spiritual renewal is something I get from going to a museum? Is that okay to do that on Shabbat? Well, if you were Orthodox, no. But you might say, this is how I observe my Shabbat. This is what gives me a sense of renewal. So it's complicated. And as I said, even if you're Orthodox, it's complicated because not all decisions are the same about what constitutes a particular kind of work. So you have to go to your rabbi and ask. Nobody asked me though, believe me. Okay, Doug, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Back when I was in college through Hillel, early on, what we tried to do, and for those who don't know, Hillel is the college organization for all Jews on campus. Anyway, and it can be everything from Reform, Reconstructionists, all the way up through Orthodox, and that we really try as a group to learn from each other, so you can learn from different traditions within the Jewish world. And it was fascinating because we would do Shabbat often together. And it tended to fall more conservative, though a lot of people at Hillel in San Francisco State were conservative. But we would take sections, like if there was a particular block or a courtyard that we were all together for Shabbat, that would be our little world. So we could bring food in there. We just couldn't bring food across the street. So if all of a sudden people meandered or walked across the street, that wasn't part of our world. And it was so interesting learning from the different traditions, because usually the houses that we would use or the courtyards we would use, because of Orthodox, you would have heating plates that would keep things warm that had started the day before. Water had kept on the day before. But the funniest thing is, like, the lights are on everywhere. And that was one of the things I found so interesting just from my own tradition. And then going into a house where the lights were always on, especially in the winter, or it could be in the summer as well, because again, you can't turn on the lights. So before Shabbat begins, you turn on all the lights in the house so that you don't have to worry about it. If you go into the washroom or into the restroom, you have a little stack of toilet paper with all the different squares already. So it's very interesting, because you would have people who had only been in the Reform tradition, for example, who would be like going, this is some of the strangest things ever. But we all learned. And the Orthodox were also willing, which is really cool, to do things more with some of the people from Reform, because it was a learning experience. And we had made that commitment at the beginning of the year. So you could really see the different range of experiences, and talking about people who had grown up Orthodox in Crown Heights, for example, and how different that world would be than it was for us in San Francisco in our little Jewish world. So anyway, just my little observation.
Thanks. Okay, Beverly, did you want to weigh in?
Start
Okay.
over.
One of the things that I remember the minute is that if we lived on the 5th floor and there was an elevator, but you weren't allowed to ask someone to press the button for you.
Right.
So, but you then would say, wouldn't it be nice if someone put,
Exactly.
there were ways around it. There was always like a way around.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, actually in LA, even in the Pico Robertson area, on Shabbat, the traffic lights are automated. So they go on and off at different times so that you don't have to press the button to make, to be able to cross the street.
Yeah.
In like Cedar Sinai and some of these Jewish hospitals, they usually have a Shabbos elevator that stops on every floor without you having to press the buttons. Sort of like, does this really go along with the, the real spirit of the law, or is this just the letter of the law? Like, I'm not pressing the button, but I'm still making use of electricity. But that's that's how it gets done. Yeah. The idea, though, really, to be fair about it, is not to have an impact on the environment. Obviously, you're having an impact, but you're not directly having an impact. And there's something that's been called a Shabbos Goy. So that's Shabbos with Shabbat pronounced in the Ashkenazi way, Goy being a non-Jew, where theoretically they can do certain things that you can't, but you can't ask them, as Beverly just said. You can sit in a room and go, brr, it's really cold in here. I wish someone would turn on the heat, but you can't say, please turn on the heat, because like you're not allowed to tell someone else to do something you're prohibited from doing. But again, I think, there's some silly things about this, but I think we also should think about what it is that Shabbat is as a gift, because how many of us get burnt out from just working all the time? Yes, I'm guilty. And not taking the time to just, kind of renew ourselves and feel refreshed on some way, in some way. Okay, and yes, Christine?
I have a funny story. My surrogate dad was a very non-observant Jew, and Stanley used to save all of his office paperwork. He was a chair of a department for Sunday because he said if ever there was uncreative activity, it's responding to memos from a dean. Anyway, so he would have been like stoned, but there we go.
Okay, great. All right, so now based on what Suzanne said before, here is this beautiful piece by Abraham Joshua Heschel. I highly recommend this book called The Sabbath. It's a very small, little thin book. And it's really, even though it's written theoretically in prose, it's really kind of a poem. And he says the meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space, right? When you're kicked out of your country and you don't have that space anymore and you don't have the temple, then the Sabbath can celebrate something else. 6 days a week, we live under the tyranny of things of space. On the Sabbath, we try to become attuned to holiness and time. It is a day on which we are called to share in what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world. And he talks about the Sabbath as a palace in time. So rather than building some big fancy temple, which of course people have done, the idea here is you celebrate the time, not the place, not the space. And as I said, I think this is beautiful. You turn from the creation, the results of creation, to the mystery of creation. So this is why when I say you're supposed to be, not to do, you are just going to sit and be amazed at the miracle of life and creation and the world, and appreciate what you have, what your blessings are, which too often we don't bother doing. We don't have the time, we're too stressed, whatever it is. This is part of what actually has happened with the pandemic, right? We've been forced to kind of slow down and to say, wait, maybe hearing birds sing is a good thing, And once we are able to take that time to stop and contemplate and appreciate, we develop gratitude. And gratitude is very important. And you can say, hey, you know what? I am grateful for a lot of things that I was taking for granted. And other people don't have this advantage. And maybe by focusing on my gratitude, I can think about people who might be in need that maybe I should try to serve too. So I try to tell people there are different kinds of mitzvot, of commandments. They're clearly ethical mitzvot. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. Okay, those are ethical. But the ritual ones have an ethical component as well, because if you observe Shabbat, you're going to give your workers a rest. You're going to be grateful for what you have. You are going to hopefully then think about people who don't have the blessings you have. And so it does lead you, hopefully, to a more ethical space. This is Sharon Brous. I should have put Rabbi Sharon Brous. Anyway, she's the rabbi of Ikar in Los Angeles. Every seventh day, we're called to step out of the world as it is and reimagine the world as it ought to be, to stand on the margins of society rather than deep within it, and see with new perspective what is broken, what is beautiful, and what is possible. We take this holy task very seriously. So in addition to the appreciation that you can develop for the world, you can also reimagine the world. I'm grateful for the things I have, but I'm noticing that there are some issues that need to be resolved because I'm taking the time to notice. And so maybe I can understand that there's another way the world can be, and maybe I can help transform it. Okay, this is for you, Beverly, because Shabbat is often defined in terms of prohibitions against certain kinds of activities. Many American Jews have come to think of Shabbat or Sabbath observance as a series of restrictions, a weekly sentence of self-denial. But Shabbat is not a retreat from the world or an exercise in asceticism. Making Shabbat is not a matter of refraining, but of doing. Resting, eating, and praying are not only permitted, but mandated. There are other verbs for Shabbat too: sleeping, reading, thinking, studying, talking, listening, meditating, visiting the sick, laughing, singing, welcoming guests, making love. But it is not entirely easy to choose even so pleasant and life-giving a discipline as Shabbat. So it's not that you don't do anything. You don't sit there like a log for 24 hours. You spend time with your family. You enjoy meals together. You invite friends. Visiting the sick, always important. You go to synagogue. You pray. You sing. There are things that you actually do. And resting is actually in some ways a real action because you have to really consciously decide, I am going to rest. I am not going to keep doing things. Gee, yes, it's dirty down there, but I'm not cleaning today, right? For chronically overscheduled people, sitting still for an hour, much less an afternoon, can be a real challenge. However, these are precisely the reasons that many people view Shabbat prohibitions less as sacrifices than as opportunities to reorient an overly hectic life around the need for rest, relaxation, and time with family and close friends. And that's from Anita Diamond, who I recommended one of her books to those who are interested in converting. All right, now this is a beautiful way also of looking at Shabbat. So a great pianist was once asked by an ardent admirer, how do you handle the notes as well as you do? He answered, the notes I handle no better than many pianists, but the pauses between the notes, that is where the art resides. In great living, as in great music, the art may be in the pauses. Surely one of the enduring contributions which Judaism made to the art of living was the Shabbat, the pauses between the notes. And it is to the Shabbat that we must look if we're able to restore to our lives a sense of serenity and sanctity, which Shabbat offers in such joyous abundance. So it's those pauses between the notes that are important, not just the notes, not all that doing, all that crazy busyness. And here is a little prayer for Shabbat. God, help us now to make this new Shabbat. After noise, we seek quiet. After crowds of indifferent strangers, we seek to touch those we love. After concentration on work and responsibility, we seek freedom to meditate, to listen to our inward selves. We open our eyes to the hidden beauties and the infinite possibilities in the world. You are in the world you are creating. We break open the gates of the reservoirs of goodness and kindness in ourselves and in others. We reach toward one holy, perfect moment of Shabbat. So now I would like to see if just reading a few of those pieces gives you a different sense of what Shabbat is about. Christine, did you have Christine Roberts, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had kind of a silly one. On the list of restrictions, it said you couldn't put out a fire. So if you're truly Orthodox and your house caught on fire,
No, saving a life, saving a life always takes precedence. Absolutely, absolutely. No, you don't let your house burn down. No,
Okay.
But for example, if you light, so here's an interesting thing. We're gonna look at the blessings for lighting the candles and everything on Shabbat, but what you will notice is if you have attended any of our services, okay, normally when you do a blessing, you do the blessing first and then you do the act. Like, you take a piece of bread, motzi lechem min haaretz, and when I'm done, I'll eat the bread. The one exception is lighting the candles on Shabbat. Anybody know why? Christine?
Because you have to do it before Shabbat begins, and then the prayer comes whenever.
Exactly. So once you said the, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'hadlik ner shel Shabbat, which means blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who hallows us with commandments and commands us to light the Shabbat candles. Once you've said that, it's Shabbat, and you cannot light the candles anymore. So there's, again, a legal fiction. A lot of the stuff employs very clever legal maneuvers. So you light the candles first, you kind of hide it from your face. Then you say the blessing, and oh, the candles are already lit. What do you know? Okay, now, and you're not supposed to blow them out. But if the candle drops and starts burning your house, yes, you can stop it. Okay, Sasha.
Well, just as a side, I just wanted to say I really liked how Harold Kushner talked about this. He was just so not rigid about like how you adapt to the seasons, and you maybe if somebody comes home and lights the candle, you can wait to do the blessing until later. I mean, I just appreciated his way of doing that because I was raised Seventh-day Adventist, which is a Protestant Christian tradition that observes the Jewish Sabbath.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I wanted to ask what you were allowed to do on Sunday, but my Wi-Fi went haywire.
what you're allowed to do on Sunday. Well, Sunday is the first day of the week, according to, in other words, our week begins on Sunday in the Jewish calendar. So Sunday is day
Yeah.
one. In fact, it's called day one.
Oh,
And Monday is day two, and it's all numbered.
I
Starting with,
see.
yeah. So Sunday you can do anything you want. Well, within reason, let's put it that way. Are there other questions or comments? No? Okay, Christine.
I just was wondering, I mean, just on a practicality basis, what happened? I mean, presumably you have ways of addressing the needs of children. What happens if your baby poops all over the place? You have to clean them up. Somebody has to do that. What about the work that needs to be done, for all kinds of reasons, that you either bracket it as uncreative, right? Or maybe there's another way of seeing it. So I'm just wondering.
Well,
Especially for
again,
children.
I think in the reform movement, there are creative ways of seeing it. Like there was
Yeah.
this book that was put out by the reform movement a number of years ago that said, well, if you want to go to the museum, maybe that's a way to, be fulfilled spiritually, whatever. I don't think they would put the same book out today. I think the reform movement has become a little more traditional. But again, the idea with the reform movement is that you are going to do informed choice. So you do it based on having examined the mitzvah and then making a decision on whether or not this mitzvah is something that is meaningful to you. It's not that you don't do it because you're reform, and, depending, like, for example, in the conservative movement, even though you're not supposed to drive on Shabbat, there are, a number of places that allow you to drive to shul, to the synagogue. You just can't drive, for pleasure or, to go to the mall. And by the way, I don't think the reform movement would say, oh yeah, if going to the mall makes you feel spiritually fulfilled, why don't you do that? No, that would not work. But maybe a museum, I don't know. Tammy?
Yeah, I kind of feel like this gets back to the ethos of what we're talking about here, right? At the end of the day, this is about renewing ourselves. It's doing self-care. It's engaging in mindfulness practices where we're focused on the miracle of everything we have and to restore that piece of us. And so then it's, do we go by the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, right? And for each one of us, we're going to have an individual take. Like, would I be, disinclined to take an emergency client and drive to their house if they were in crisis? Well, the whole idea is to save a life. So that trumps everything. However, going to the mall because I want to do some retail therapy, not so much. But
Retail therapy.
Right, retail therapy. But this whole idea of God wants us to take care of ourselves. God wants us to take care of the earth and take care of our animals and take care of our strangers.
Yes.
Right. So it's the spirit. And I guess that's the way I'm looking at it, is it's the spirit of the law and not so much the letter of the law.
Right. Well, again, if you're reform, it's going to be more in the spirit of the law. If you're Orthodox, it's going to be a little more the letter of the law. They don't bend the rules as easily as we do. But in terms of this business about taking the time to basically smell the roses, I don't think I told you this story. If I did, stop me, which is the story about the Washington Post and trying to experiment with art outside of a museum or a concert hall with Joshua Bell. Anybody? Okay. So the Washington Post ran an experiment many years ago. They said, well, how are people going to judge art if it's not like in a concert hall or in a museum or somewhere else? So they decided to do an experiment. They took Joshua Bell, which some of you may know. He's like one of the premier violinists in the world, just amazing, playing a beautiful piece by Bach with a Stradivarius, big fancy, violin. And they put him in the subway wearing a baseball cap, looking just like any old, person playing in the subway. And they were saying, how are we going to deal with crowd control? Because how many people are going to want to hear Joshua Bell? I mean, you normally would have to pay a lot of money. So what do you think happened?
I think a lot of people just saw him as a regular musician.
Yep. People just walked by because you know what? It was rush hour. Everybody was like, got to get to work, got to do whatever. What was the exception to people doing that, do you think? Who would have been attracted to beautiful music and not worried about keeping on schedule?
Music
Kids.
lovers. Music lovers.
Music
Children.
lovers, yeah.
Children.
Children. It was children, because children are like, oh, that's beautiful. Like, I don't have anywhere to be, except maybe kindergarten. So that was, very interesting that people did not stop to smell the roses. We all get it. I would have been in the same situation, I'm sure. The point is, though, that a lot of times there are blessings out there that we don't notice because we don't take the time. And when Moses first encounters God at the burning bush, God only speaks to Moses when Moses has turned aside from his path, okay? Moses is going forward. He's a shepherd. He's taking care of his sheep. He notices a bush that's burning and not being consumed, which takes time to notice, because otherwise it would just look like a burning bush. He takes the time, he turns aside. That's when God speaks to him. So we have to turn aside. We have to take that time and say, oh, what are the blessings around here? And we get so busy that all of a sudden, we're like 60 years old or whatever, and we go, whoa, where's my life gone? And again, as awful as the pandemic is, it is sort of forcing us in some ways to take a step back and say, what's important and how do I really want to spend my time? Yes, Beverly.
Say how profound this feels for me, because and it's like Shabbat is the metaphor for the difference between feeling closed off from the world, like defined by the restrictions and the difference, rather than being part of the world, rather feeling that as your soul connecting to the world, and that's profound, and it really is changing me. I'm
glad.
I'm saying that really.
I'm glad.
It's amazing. So,
well, it's like the morning rituals. And what I say to people is, because like, especially right now, somebody dies, it might take a really long time to bury them, especially if they're going to be buried in the National Cemetery here. Somebody in my congregation died. It's a month later that they're getting a date to bury the person. So what do? You're not in, are you in Shiva? Your Shiva is after the person's been buried and the person's still not buried, right? So what do? So my feeling is the rituals are there to help us, not for us to do the rituals. So we, click our heels and do what God said, right? So my feeling about all this is that this should be there to help us be better people and to live more fulfilled lives, not like, yes, I'm going to check off all the mitzvot that I, agreed to. So that's how I like to look at the Sabbath. Okay, let's just take a, 10-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to look at some of the blessings for Shabbat. And I'm going to also try to go through the service. I did it very briefly at the end of our bar mitzvah class, but I'm going to try to go into it in a little more detail. So if you do attend a service, hopefully you'll have some sense of, what's going on. So let's come back at 10 after 2. Okay, welcome back. I have a couple of answers for things that were asked. So let me share this with you. Somebody asked about why 2 stitches rather than 1. Why we're not allowed to do that. So Av Malacha is, one of the forbidden works, either by sewing 3 stitches or by sewing 2 stitches and then tying the thread with a knot so that the stitches remain. Without this last step, the stitches will not last, and therefore one does not violate the Malacha min HaTorah, means the work from the Torah. So in other words, apparently, if you only do 1 stitch, it doesn't really do anything. So you need at least 2 stitches to actually make something hold. And so that's what's forbidden. And I hope that answer is sufficient. All right, then the other question was about taking a bath or a shower. And this is from Aish HaTorah, which is an Orthodox site. So first of all, the problem is the hot water, right? You don't want to end up boiling the water, which is forbidden on Shabbat. So that's, oops. So that's one problem is using the hot water. And then there's a custom not to bathe the entire body. I've done some reading in the Talmud about this, and I think part of the problem is that even if you're taking a cold shower or a cold bath, people might perceive that what you're doing is taking a hot one. So there's something called marat ayin where you don't do certain things because it looks like you're doing something forbidden, even if you're actually not. And then there's also something called smoothing that you're not allowed to do. So rub solid soap on our bodies, right? You could do liquid soap. Also, you're not supposed to squeeze anything out of, let's say, your hair. So as you can see, there are all these different prohibitions that are involved in taking a shower or a bath or whatever. But it says that if you're very hot and uncomfortable, you may take a cold shower. You may also use liquid soap on non-hairy areas of your body, but you should be careful not to squeeze water out of your hair or out of the towel. Okay, so I hope that answers the question about why you can't do this. All right, let's see.
Thank you.
Someone asked me, one of the books suggested an appropriate bar mitzvah gift is $300. Is this accurate? No, that's insane. I don't know what site that was on or who was making that suggestion, but that is utterly nuts. No, that is not at all appropriate.
And isn't it supposed to be in increments of 18? And even if you are going to give something, and most of the time you're supposed to give to a charity of some sort, and you do it in the denominations of 18 to signify life, right?
Well, you know, you don't have to do it that way, but very often that is what people do, is they do increments of 18 when they make a donation to an organization or as a gift or whatever. But you can also give a book or a, you know, there are all kinds of things you can give. $300 is quite excessive, I think, unless you're living in Beverly Hills or somewhere. I don't know. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the blessings. So this is a nice thing here. The commandment to bless the wine is a commandment to drink life as deeply as we drink from this cup. It is a commandment to bless life and to love deeply. It's a commandment to remember with Shabbat heart, to act with Shabbat hands, to see the world with Shabbat eyes. It's a commandment to laugh until we are all laughter, to sing until we are all song, to dance until we are all dance, to love until we are all love. This is the wine that God has commanded us to bless and drink. So wine is always an important part of any Jewish celebration because it is a special drink that is theoretically a little more expensive than your regular beverages. So we're going to look at the blessings now. I'm going to share the screen with you and we'll take a look. And by the way, if you go to reformjudaism.org, you can get these blessings and you can get a lot of very good information there.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Kay, and here at Reform Judaism, we get all kinds of questions about Shabbat and how to do it. These are the things that you're going to need for Shabbat. You will need a tzedakah box, you will need candlesticks with candles in it, a kiddush cup with wine or juice in it, and challah with a cloth to cover it. So the first thing that we do for Shabbat is to put some money in a tzedakah box. And tzedakah is our practice of giving money to those who are in need. We think it's a nice way to start Shabbos by giving some tzedakah. The second thing that we do is we light Shabbat candles. And after we light the candles, we bring our hands to our eyes 3 times, cover our eyes, and say the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. And as we uncover our eyes, Shabbat has begun. the next thing that we do is we say kiddush, which is the blessing over the fruit of the vine or the wine or grape juice that you have. And it's always good to have a prayer book with you so that you're sure that you're saying the words with intentionality. You're going to elevate your cup of wine or your grape juice. And there are two versions of kiddush. One is longer, one is shorter. So for now, we're going to use the shorter version for the sake of brevity. But if you look right here, you'll see a link. And if you go to that link, you can find the language and the words and the audio of the longer version as well. So raise our kiddush cup and we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. The last thing that we do is we bless the challah. So you may notice that some people use 2 chalot or maybe use a little bit of salt, which is part of Jewish custom, but you're going to take the cover off. You're going to lift your challah up and you're going to say the blessing, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And then lots of people will say B'tei Avon at the end. Now, some families are cutting families, some families are tearing families. It's kind of up to you to figure out what you want to be. And then we say Shabbat Shalom.
Okay. So, what was I? Oh yeah, the tzedakah money you would do before Shabbat because you're not supposed to handle money on Shabbat. And tzedakah really, I mean, it doesn't mean charity. It really means righteousness. So tzedakah is partly donating money, but it's also donating your time and your energy. So it's not just about money. But it's a nice thing to think about on Shabbat. Then, yeah, some people rip the bread and pass it around. And when we have a family Shabbat, when we used to have a real life, when kids were actually in the sanctuary, they would stick their fingers inside the challah and nobody would ever want to touch any of that bread afterwards. But they enjoyed it. So, there are different practices like, the person holding the bread, you can have other people touching the bread or touching the person touching the bread. And, that's kind of a nice thing to do. So those are the basic blessings for Friday night. They actually really belong in the home, and we've exported them to the synagogue because most people don't do it at home, but that's something that all of you can do on a Friday night. You can all do that. You just need the candles and a nice little glass to put some grape juice or wine in and a challah. Okay, any questions about that or comments? Brandon, did you? Oh, go ahead.
I just had my first Shabbat observance this past Friday night. I want to say challah is a lot harder to make than it seems. So definitely, if you're not down for 4 hours of making challah, definitely buy it from the store. It is very difficult to make, and even when I made it, I didn't make it right. So
okay, well, you have to be able to braid it. That's the trick.
The braiding is the easy part. The dryness is the hard part.
Yeah. I just made some challah the other day. It was pretty dry, so a lot of butter, I think. Okay, Carlos.
Quick question. If you celebrate Shabbat at the synagogue, is it then customary to come home and do it as well, like the candles and do all of that?
Some people do it at home and then come to the synagogue, but I would say overall, see, the Friday night service is actually not the important service. The important service is Saturday morning.
Okay.
And because you're not supposed to actually read the Torah except Monday, Thursday, and Saturday during the day. But what happened was in the Reform movement, because a lot of kids have soccer and softball and whatever on Saturday, the Friday night service became much more important. And that's what people would come to in the Reform movement. And so we actually used to do a lot more Torah reading on Friday night. Now we did it this past week because of the bar mitzvah, but we normally don't do it. It takes a long time. We started the service at 6:30 and I think we were done maybe around 8:30. So
yeah, 8:30.
It's a long service. Yeah. So generally what people would do is they would do the stuff at home and they would go to the synagogue briefly, or the men would go to the synagogue.
Okay.
But in the Reform movement, as I said, a lot of stuff is morphed into the synagogue because it's not being done at home.
Thank you.
Another question? Okay, so we talked about what happens on Shabbat. Obviously, you begin the evening with these blessings and go to services, maybe go to service on Saturday morning, and, have lunch with friends and family and whatever. At the end of Shabbat, there is a service called the Havdalah. Now, Havdalah means distinction. So you're distinguishing between the holiness of Shabbat and then the, secularity or whatever of the rest of the week. So I'm going to share with you actually the blessings for Havdalah. All right. So Havdalah is a Hebrew word that means division or separation, and it's the name of a ritual that formally ends Shabbat, separating it from the beginning of the new week. By the way, at the end of Yom Kippur, which is the end of the high holidays, we also have a Havdalah service to separate the holy days from the rest of the year. But every Saturday evening, we theoretically do a Havdalah service. So first, there's a blessing over a cup of wine. Of course, it's always wine for a happy occasion. And the blessing is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. Then there's a blessing over fragrant spices that are in a special spice box. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei v'samim. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, creator of many kinds of spices. And you see here in the picture, this thing that has a little flag next to it is the spice box. It's like a little tower with a flag next to it. And then this little cup here is the wine cup. And then we have the candles, which, again, here's the candle. It's a braided candle here. Can't see it as well in that picture. And the blessing is, blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, creator of the lights of the fire. I didn't put the Hebrew in. And then you do a final blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who makes a distinction between the holy and the secular. And here is, this is the candle holder here, which is kind of a square because the candle is a kind of flat braided candle, the wine cup and the spice box. They come in different shapes and colors and whatever. And then we conclude with Eliyahu Hanavi, where we're asking for Eliyahu, which is Elijah, the prophet, to come, because obviously whenever Elijah comes, that means that the Messiah is coming. And then we end with Shavua Tov, which means have a good week. So I'm going to share with you now the music for that. This is written by Debbie Friedman, who's very, oh, you know what? I forgot to make sure I'm sharing the sound before I do that. Okay, I am. Oops, that's not it. There we are. Okay, here we go.
La
So with the Havdalah service, what happens is you first do the blessing over the wine. Then with the spice box, you actually pass the spice box around to other people to smell. Usually you have like cinnamon and cloves and those kinds of nice spices, and you pass it around. And the idea is that the sweetness of Shabbat should accompany you for the rest of the week. And then when the candle is being blessed, you're supposed to kind of get the reflection of the light on your nails. That's why she was kind of doing that. And at the end, when you're done, you stick the lit candle into the wine to extinguish it. Suzanne.
I guess that was the part that I was going to ask you about. That's the part that's always that seems the most awkward to me. Like, do you actually dip the candle in the wine or pour it over? Okay.
You dip it in and extinguish it that way. And you don't drink it after. Okay, so I would like to now go through the service a little bit. Now, I've put together a couple things. It may be a little hard to follow. That's why I sent you a handout. I think everybody got it. That lists the different prayers. And I only have a half an hour. So this is going to be a very introductory way of understanding the service. It's not going to be something that you'll just say, oh yeah, now I get it, because it's, it's complicated, but I wanted to at least start. And obviously, any questions are more than welcome. So I made you a beautiful picture. Oh, why does it keep doing that? Okay. This is pretty much the shape of the service, according to my professor of liturgy from way back, Larry Hoffman. So it's sort of a little bit like a mountain, as you can see. And there's like a going up to a pinnacle of the service. Now, when I asked my fifth graders what the pinnacle of the service was or what it was all leading to, they said the oneg, which is the dessert afterwards, which I guess for a fifth grader is what counts. But it's actually the Torah service. So the beginning of the service, the warm up, which is not the technical term, but that's a term that Dr. Hoffman used, to get ready to pray. How do you get ready to pray? Well, one of the ways, is to, get very centered and calm and intentional. But to get your juices flowing, you're going to probably want to sing. So you have Kabbalat Shabbat. We're talking about Friday night. I'm not even talking about Saturday morning, just Friday night, Kabbalat Shabbat. So you sing a bunch of psalms. There's a psalm for every day of the week. And then there's Lecha Dodi. So I'm going to also go back and forth here. I have candle lighting first. Yeah, that's what we do. That's not, really officially what's in the service. But Kabbalat Shabbat is welcoming the Shabbat. So you have a bunch of psalms, and then you have Lecha Dodi, which is something that was written by the mystics of our tradition to welcome the Sabbath bride. They would go out into nature wearing white and welcoming the Sabbath bride. And Shabbat was the bride of God, or Israel's the bride of God, depending on how you want to look at it. That's sort of the warm up for the service. Now, in the morning, I didn't put that in here, but you also have the Saturday morning. And in the morning, it's similar. There are a few blessings that you say in the morning about putting on your talit, your prayer shawl, or, waking up and saying, my body's working, that's great. Now I can actually praise God. There are a bunch of blessings that you say in the morning, and then you sing some songs, some psalms. So in the morning and in the evening, you have this, kind of warm up section. And then the Chatzi Kaddish is a kind of punctuation. But the actual real beginning, of the service is the Baruch Hu, the call to worship, which is Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamvorach, or however you sing it. It's a call to worship. I'm asking you to bless God, and you respond by actually doing it. And that's, in a way, you're saying, yes, I am now ready to pray. It's the muezzin of of Islam, who will call out, throughout the towers of their mosques, and you hear, oh, it's time to pray. That's what the Baruch Hu is, and that's, once upon a time when there was a temple, the priests would do this, okay, time to praise God, go ahead. We'll praise God. So that's the real beginning of the service. Before that, it's just a warm up. And now there are two major parts of the service leading up to the pinnacle, which we'll get to. First is the Shema, right? So Shema is the Shema and its blessings. Shema is where we say God is one, right? We say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. We say God is one. And that's significant because if God is one and we're made in God's image, then we're all one. And around the Shema are blessings. So here I put, there's 3 blessings around the Shema. And here I listed them. The first one in the evening is called the Ma'ariv Aravim. It's a blessing about creation. So the first thing we say about God is God created the world. In the evening, it's called the Ma'ariv Aravim, which means God brings on the evening. In the morning, it's called Yotzer Or, which means God brings on light. But the whole point is that the world was created with a purpose. We are not here just randomly. It's not like a bunch of molecules or atoms smashed against each other, and now we have a world. God created the world with intention. And so that's the first blessing. The second blessing is about revelation, that God loves us enough that God gave us God's Torah, which is a sort of blueprint for living an ethical life. You see the word ahava. The word ahava means love. And ahavat olam means eternal love. So out of love, God gave us the Torah. In the morning, it's a similar prayer. It's called ahava rabbah, which means great love. So, the prayers are slightly different in the morning than in the evening. Obviously, in the evening, you're going to talk about darkness and stars. And in the morning, you're going to talk about light. But it's the same idea. There are these blessings that come right before you say the Shema. Then you say the Shema, Shema Yisrael, or however, whatever the tune is that you're going to do. Now, the Shema includes the Ve'ahavta. You notice Ve'ahavta is similar to Ahavat. So Ve'ahavta means you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. So just as God loves us enough to reveal Torah to us, we in turn love God back. So the line of the Shema that, God is one and you shall love the Lord your God are both from Deuteronomy chapter 6. And after we recite the Shema, we recognize the third important function of God, which is that God redeemed us from Egypt, redemption, Geulah, that's what that means. Morning and evening are similar, slightly different words. So the idea is that God redeemed us from Egypt, and thus we also know that God redeems us regularly. How many times have we felt that, our lives were over on some, spiritual level, but then we were redeemed? So we recognize God's redemptive power. And part of that prayer is a part of the Song of the Sea, which is what we sang when we got to the other side of the Red Sea on dry land, and we sang Mi Chamocha, who is like you, God? Amazing, amazing, amazing. In the evening, now we don't always do this at the temple. In the evening, we often, or sometimes we'll do the Hashkivenu, which is an evening prayer, hoping that we will wake up in the morning, because it comes from the medieval period when people didn't know, in fact, if they would wake up, if they were lying down to sleep. And usually we either do that or we do Vishamru, something about observing Shabbat. Vishamru means you shall observe Shabbat. We saw that earlier when we were looking at Shabbat. Or Yismachu, which means to enjoy Shabbat. So that is the first part of, so we're going up here. So, oops. Can't touch anything without having it mess up. Okay, so we started off with a warm up, the call to worship, and the Shema and its blessings. So I'm going to stop this for a moment and see if anybody has any questions. Does anybody have any questions about this so far? Having a prayer book next to you would probably be useful as well, but the prayer book actually has a column on the side that tells you where we are in the service and what prayer or blessing we're saying. But I just want you to see, and it might not always be terribly obvious, but I want you to see that there's a direction to this, and there is a, it is part, this is constructed in a very specific way, okay? It's not random. We don't just kind of throw in different kinds of prayers and things just for the heck of it. They're there for a reason, okay? Any questions? No? Okay, so we're gonna go on with the rest of this. The next section is called, now this is called the tefillah. It has 3 different names actually, but we're just going to call it the tefillah for right now. Tefillah means the prayer. It is the prayer of the service that was developed by the rabbis. So I'm going to go to the other slide to show you the specifics. So if you look at the right-hand side, so tefillah is also the standing prayer. I did the transliteration slightly differently here. T apostrophe, 1 L. It doesn't really matter. It's the different ways you spell Hanukkah. So there's 7 blessings on Shabbat for this prayer. The first one is actually avot ve'imahot, fathers and mothers, but really meaning ancestors. And it's Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel v'Elohei Leah. So we're recognizing that God is the God of our ancestors. It's traditionally been about the ancestor males, but we added the women, the imahot. And we ask God, because of the merit of our ancestors, God, please have mercy on us and be kind to us. The second blessing is Gevurot, which is divine power. Atah gibur le'olam Adonai mechayeh hakol atah rab lahoshia. And this is the one that I talked about last week, where we're recognizing in the traditional blessing that God actually revives the dead, makes the dead come back alive. And I mentioned last week that we changed the wording in the Reform movement because we don't believe that God revives the dead. We believe that God makes everything live. The third blessing is about God's holiness. In the morning, it's a much longer prayer. In the evening, it's a short prayer. Doesn't matter. It's, as I said, the evening service is not as important as the morning service. Then there's a blessing called Kedushat Hayom, the holiness of the day. Yom is day. So Shabbat, of course, is the day. Now, during the week, instead of having this 4th blessing, there are 13 blessings that are stuck in here. We're not going to go through them all, but they have to do with asking for justice, for asking for a harvest, for asking for health. There are a lot of different blessings that are there. They're not there on Shabbat because theoretically on Shabbat, you're getting a taste of the world to come when everything is perfect. And anyway, God is resting. So you're not going to bother God with a lot of requests. Please give us a good harvest, or please, take care of the justice for the evildoers. So we're leaving God alone on Shabbat. So instead of that, we're going to talk about the holiness of Shabbat. Then we have a blessing where we're asking God to accept our worship. Then we have a blessing where we're thanking God for everything that we have, the Hoda'ah. Now, if we have a family service here, we normally do the Hoda'ah, and the kids learn the Hoda'ah, but otherwise we usually the last couple of blessings are usually silent. And people can sort of either read the words in the prayer book or use the words of their own heart. And the final blessing is a blessing of peace, Birkat Shalom. And that's at the end of this right here. Now, during the evening, it's usually something like Shalom Rav, which means a great peace. Or in the morning, it's Sim Shalom, it means give us peace. Sometimes people do Oseh Shalom. Anyway, it's a blessing for peace. So those are the blessings of the tefillah. Now, Friday night, we normally don't have a Torah service. So this is really more relevant for Saturday morning. Everything's leading up to the moment when we're going to take the Torah out of the ark. Now, on Friday night, since we don't do that, we'll have instead like a Devar Torah, like a little word of Torah, maybe have a sermon, maybe have a guest speaker. Saturday morning is when the Torah comes out, and also Monday and Thursday, but we don't do that usually in the Reform movement. So the Torah service is supposed to feel like I am back at Mount Sinai, and the Torah is being brought down from Mount Sinai and given to me all over again. And one of the things we sing is Ki Mitzion Tetze Torah, which means from Zion comes the Torah. If you watch any of our services online through Zoom, it's going to be a very shortened Torah service because we can't go through all the ritual, given the fact that we're not in the sanctuary. But you will see somebody taking the Torah out of the ark and the blessings that go with that. And then there's something called a hakafah, which obviously we're not doing it all during Zoom, which is where you go around the sanctuary and people will touch the Torah either with their prayer shawl or with a prayer book or their finger, and then kiss their finger, kiss their prayer shawl, kiss their book. And then, which I didn't put all the different steps in here, but I mentioned before about the aliyot. The aliyah is going up. And so once you're a bar mitzvah, once you're 13, you are able to say the prayer, the blessing over the reading of the Torah. Now, reading the Torah itself, you can be 5 years old, it doesn't matter. But saying the blessing, where we actually say, God has chosen us to receive the Torah, that is something that you have to be obligated for. So you're not obligated at 5, but you're obligated at 13. And so you can say the blessing on behalf of the congregation, and they say amen. That's what amen is. Amen means thank you, I agree with you, thank you for doing that for us. And after the Torah service, you have the cool down. Again, not the official word for it, but you have the Aleinu, which is Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, which is basically, it is incumbent upon us to praise God. You have the Mourner's Kaddish, which we talked about last week, which is a prayer for those who've passed on. And now in a traditional synagogue, you'll have more than one Mourner's Kaddish. They'll be sprinkled out throughout the service. And individual mourners often have their own Mourner's Kaddish. But in the Reform movement, we have it all in one place. So we mention those for whom we're observing Shiva, which is the first 7 days of mourning, those for whom we're observing Shloshim, the first 30 days, and the first year. And then we mention Yartzites, which are the anniversaries of people's deaths. And we mention all those names together, and then we recite the Mourner's Kaddish. And then we have a closing song. So that's pretty much what I have here as well. And that's pretty much the shape of the service. Again, I'm going to send you a copy of all of this. And so hopefully that'll, make it a little bit more clear. But I just wanted you to see that the service is not just like we're saying this and that, and all the services actually follow this, whether it's during the week or on Shabbat. So during the week, you might not have some insertions that are in there for Shabbat specifically, but during Shabbat, you have some extra prayers and some extra blessings, some of which have been taken out by the Reform movement to try to lighten up the service and not have it be so long, because a typical Saturday morning service is 3 hours, which used to seem daunting to me until I started getting into it. But okay, Suzanne.
So the Aleinu is where I got lost on Friday night, because the service in the prayer book ends after the tefillah.
It ends what?
After the tefillah,
Yeah.
the Shabbat evening service, it ends after that. Like the next page is the Shabbat morning service.
Okay, so
and then we went to the Aleinu, and I was confused.
Okay, so that's the way they laid out that book. So since the Aleinu is the same for the morning and the evening, the Aleinu is on a particular page. I think it's 586. Okay. Unfortunately, and we've had to do this in the sanctuary too, the way they laid it out, the Aleinu right now, it says it's incumbent upon us to praise God we have a different destiny from everybody else. It's a very particularistic, it's almost like this, we're the chosen people. So people have written alternatives. So the first paragraph on page 586 is the alternative. We've been using the second paragraph, which is the traditional one. So it goes from the second paragraph on page 586 to the first paragraph on page 588, and then it goes to page 591. That's in that blue book. So we actually Xeroxed those specific paragraphs and stuck them in the back of the book. So when people are in the service, instead of having to turn pages and look for the right paragraph, it's just all there Xerox. But that's it. So in other words, the reason the evening service stops and then you go to the morning service is because you were then told to go to page 586 for the Aleinu, and then the mourner's Kaddish is on page 598. But that's only because they share, I mean, the mourner's Kaddish is the same whether you're in the morning or the evening. The Aleinu is the same whether you're in the morning or the evening. So that's why those, yeah. There was a lot of controversy over how to lay out this book. The way they've laid it out, it was more complicated before and people complained, but the way they laid it out is the first service has, okay, on the right side of the page, let's see, yeah, the right side, you have the more traditional prayers. On the left side, you have interpretive translations or just interpretations, period. So that theoretically, if you don't want to say the Ma'ariv the way it is, you know, in the traditional prayer, you could look on the left side and pick some other reading that really is the same topic, but, you know, written differently. That apparently was too confusing for some people. That, in other words, if you wanted to just continue with the traditional prayer, you would have to turn the page each time because there was this interpretive thing in between. So therefore, for those who were not able to turn the page or found that too confusing, there is a second service that's consecutive where you don't have to turn the page. And those are the two services in there for the morning and the evening. Yeah, it was put together by committee. Brandon.
One thing that I found to be challenging while attending Shabbat service is that sometimes some of the prayers are transliterated from Hebrew into Roman script and then into English, but then other times there isn't the English translation. So I can follow along and say the Roman transliteration, but I have no clue what I'm actually saying.
Okay, so that's because, and this occurred to me the other day. So those slides were initially put together for in sanctuary service. So I projected the prayers onto the, we just did it a few times. It wasn't every week. Then I adapted them for purposes of being here, on Zoom. And I realized that the ones that I've done recently, I've added the English. The ones that I did before, I hadn't. And I was thinking about that the other day. Gee, maybe I need to add the English. It's a lot of work. So
the only reason I asked is I didn't know if there was a religious significance of there's certain ones that you're not allowed to translate.
No, there's no religious significance. It has to do with when it was made and whether or not I have the energy to make more slides. It occurred to me the other day. I thought, maybe I need to add the English, and I'll look into that in my spare time. But yeah, there's no religious significance. Yeah, Carlos.
I have two quick questions. For a Reformed synagogue, are there services held throughout the week or just Shabbat evening, morning? Okay.
Usually it's only on Friday night, sometimes on Saturday morning. We've had some Saturday morning services. I haven't done it since we've been, under the pandemic strictures, but I was doing it like once a month, but it's very hard to get people to come. I get like maybe 10 or 15 people. Yeah, there's no daily, which makes it hard. Like if somebody really wants to, for example, as I said last time, you're supposed to say the mourner's Kaddish 3 times a day for people who are close to you who've died. And obviously it's pretty hard, and you have to have a minyan for the mourner's Kaddish. So if you're going to a Reformed synagogue, you're not going to find the minyan that you need. And so people will go to, a more traditional synagogue to do that.
Okay.
But let me tell you that most Reformed people don't do it 3 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as much of a problem as it might otherwise appear.
Okay. And then my other questions, since I've only been to services online during the pandemic, in person, when the Torah goes around, if you're not Jewish, do you abstain from touching it or? do you also participate?
You know, I'm fine with it. Some people get upset if non-Jews, you know, but for like, we have, you know, for Simchat Torah, which is the holiday where we celebrate the Torah, we unfurl it across the whole congregation and people go around and read different parts of it. We allow non-Jews to hold it. Some people get upset. You know, technically you're not supposed to, but you know, I'm not so strict about it.
Okay, thank you.
Personally, I'm not strict about a lot of things. Yeah. Other questions? Well, I hope that, you know, if you can come to our services, I would, you know, I think that's a really important thing to do. If you really want to learn about Judaism, I think you really, here's what's not fair, okay? If you're converting, you're doing it through the religious place, right? If you're born Jewish, you don't ever have to attend synagogue, okay? You can eat a bagel once in a while. So the problem is that if you're converting, you don't have to say, I'm going to come to services every single Friday from now on. No, but you should attend some services and be familiar with some of the prayers. And now the music's going to be different depending on what synagogue you go to. You know, people share tunes, but they also do new and different ones. If you're in a traditional synagogue, you're not going to have instruments and it'll be more chanting than singing. But I think it's really important to attend and to see what it's like and to have questions. And then, you know, you can decide whether or not you want to, you know, be really observant or not. That's going to be up to you if you're going to convert. If you're not converting, that's fine. But, you know, it's a good idea to attend and see what it's like. And then you can, of course, ask questions and say, I don't get why this happened. Like, you know, going through the prayer book and going, wait a minute, how come right after the evening service, it's the morning service instead of the Aleinu? Just the way the book was set, you know, set out. But I do recommend, for example, since we for very rarely now have been doing any Torah readings, to take a look on our YouTube channel at the service we did on Friday night, which was a bar mitzvah, where the young man chanted from the Torah. You know, that's a good thing to see, and you know, there are lots of services up on the YouTube channel, which are a good idea to just take a look at, become familiar with. Any other questions before we? Yes, Bobby.
Will you be giving do you usually give a talk on the Friday night service? Typically?
You mean generally or when there's a bar mitzvah?
Just generally.
So what I have been doing is I do little teachings throughout the service about the Torah portion for the week. And then I will either do a short Devar Torah. Devar Torah means a word of Torah, which means an interpretation of Torah. Or I will have a guest speaker. I've been trying to also keep the services a little bit shorter because sitting on Zoom is not so easy. But for example, this coming Friday is going to be, it's Jewish Disabilities Month. So I'm going to focus on disabilities issues. And I'm going to show a short film that was made by a cantor who trained his cousin who was 50 and disabled to have a bar mitzvah. And then he's going to speak on Sunday at 10 o'clock. And you're absolutely all invited to attend. I don't know if all of you have the information about that. I can send you. Now, the link for the service is always the same every Friday night.
Okay.
The programming, I'll send you a link for the program on Sunday if you're interested. Now, this particular cantor, his name is Stephen Pizzarn. He's from Santa Monica, from one of the synagogues in Santa Monica. And just for your interest, he was also Stephen Miller's bar mitzvah tutor. I'll leave it at that. Huh?
Wait a minute.
Yes, the Stephen Miller you're thinking about.
Whoa. Huh, interesting.
So Suzanne says she's watching Praying with Lior, which is about a young man with Down syndrome who prepares for his bar mitzvah. Yeah, so anyway, I think it'll be an interesting talk. And I'm also going to play a closing song, which is a beautiful piece that was put together by the Miracle Project, which is a combination of people with disabilities and people without disabilities singing something together, which is really, really nice. So I hope you'll be able to come. Okay, now, if you want to hang on and talk, we can do that. If you have any questions, happy to stay on, but it's just about 3 o'clock. So I want to let people go if they have other plans. And we'll see you next week. And as I said, if you'd like to stay, please do.